G'day and welcome to another episode of Tomo's Tune-Ups. On this episode, we're going to be installing the oil cooler on a Mini Clubman. I'm going to show you how to do it. Now, like always guys, don't forget to like and subscribe and leave your comments in the section below for things that you want to see me do. Big shout out to the people lately who have left those comments and wanted me to inform them on how to do specific things, not only to their Minis, but also to other cars. So we are quite fortunate installing this oil cooler on a Clubman, simply because the Clubman has a longer front nose. So it actually gives us more room to have more activities going on in the front, whereas a round nose, you're quite limited to room. So once you have a brake booster in there, once you start adding a couple extra items, it runs out of room really quickly. So it's going to be quite simple compared to someone who would be working on a round nose. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is remove the front grille, and then we're going to get into mounting the oil cooler and then running the lines. Now the good thing about the Mini is that they aren't held together by many screws or bolts whatsoever, so it is quite easy to work on even if you don't have the right tools or the equipment to pull it apart. Always remember though to separate all the screws and bolts into separate containers or put them aside so that way you know where they are, and make sure they're clearly labelled if you're pulling it apart for the first time. Now because I have the light bar fitted, I just have to disconnect the wiring from the inside, and then we're just going to have to pull the wiring through. That way we can ensure that we don't catch the light bar at the front when we go to remove the grille. So the light bar has been removed, or at least undone. We can then slide the grille forward. We should just be able to pull this up and out of the way far enough for us to get it past it without having to remove the light bar itself. Okay, fantastic. So we're just going to sit that off to the side, that way we're not going to damage it. Okay, so what we want to try and do is mount this as high as possible. That way the more airflow we can get going over here, the cooler the oil is going to be. Now, if we mounted it too high, we may not be able to allow the pipes to be fitted, but good thing that they both have a 90-degree female fitting on the end, which will enable us to mount it as high as we can without making contact with the crossbar at the top. Now this is a 13-row oil cooler, so there's 13 of these rows in between here. The bigger it is, the more oil can travel through there. The smaller it is, obviously the less oil can travel. Now this oil cooler holds approximately 230 to 250 mils, which means that you need to remember that when you change the oil, you're going to have to add that little bit of extra oil in there to make sure that it fills up the oil cooler itself. This is what we call an air to oil cooler, which means that the air is coming over the top and it is cooling the oil inside there. Most cars nowadays are fitted with a coolant to oil cooler, which means that not only oil travels through there, but also coolant as well. So the coolant is cooler than the oil, which then cools the oil. It does sound very confusing, but it is very simple. It's either air to oil or it is coolant to oil in most modern day cars. Alright, so just doing a couple of eyeball measurements, I think we mounted about here. This is what's going to give us the maximum amount of airflow and room to be able to work with. Just thinking about it now, we have one short pipe and we have one long pipe. So we want to ensure that we can get access to both the pipes, not only inside here, but also where it attaches to the engine block and down to the oil filter. If the line's going to be too short or too long, it may not reach, or we might have excessive amount of room that we need to stretch it to. So on second thought, we might actually mount it here. That way it is definitely out of the way and it's not going to be restricting too much airflow to anything of great importance. Okay, so in the kit it comes with a few things. It comes with two different sized pipes. One's going to be going straight to the engine and then to the cooler. The other one's going to be going from the oil filter housing to the cooler itself. It also comes with a couple of black L-shaped brackets that we may use depending how we go. It comes with an assortment of bolts and nuts, along with two bits of flat steel that we can bend into shape depending where we want to mount it. And then it also comes with a set of instructions. Now, we're not going to be needing those, so piss those off. So what we're going to do is have a look at the cooler itself and then try and figure out where we're going to mount it and how we're going to bend these brackets to suit the mount. So as you can see, it comes with a couple of different size holes. Depending where you want to mount it, you can bend the piece of metal into shape. So what we might do is mount it here, and then we're going to bend a bit of an L bracket down here and then down and across. That way we can mount it in a bit of a C shape underneath there, and that way it's supported off the grill itself. All right, so next thing we're going to do is grab the oil cooler and the bracket along with some bolts, and we're going to attach the bracket to the oil cooler. You want to make sure that you use the right bolt for the right hole. So if that's the case, get the smaller bolt, it goes in the top. If you go to put the big bolt in the top, it's not going to fit, therefore you know that it doesn't go in that hole. We are just going to mock this up, so we're just going to put the bolts in. We're only going to tighten them by hand. Once everything's in place, we can then go and tighten it all using tools. Now, one of the best and worst things about working on the Mini is, the best thing is it's a small car, it's fun to work on. The worst thing is, because it's so bloody small, you got to be on your hands and knees to do everything, unless you use a jack and jack it up every time you want to work on it, which can become quite difficult depending on the amount of room that you have. But for me, you know, it's quite easy to be able to just kneel down here and just sit at a comfortable height rather than bending over a car that's been lifted 5 inches, for instance. Many four-wheel drives that I work on at work are lifted quite high. So to be able to work on something that's got a 5-inch lift kit compared to this is quite simple. I'd much prefer to be kneeling down than to be standing on 3 milk crates trying to get to the oil filter at the back of the engine. Now that we've got the brackets mounted, we're just going to take off the remaining yellow cap, and we're going to mount it and just see where it sits, and then we can draw out some holes where it's going to be drilled into, and then we can drill the holes to make it work. All right, so I've got it sitting approximately where I want it to be. Now, it's out of the way of the latch as well as the little release mechanism. It is definitely far enough behind the grille that it is not going to be touching, and it's far enough away from the headlight as well. So we can go mark out the bottom holes where we want it to be drilled, drill the holes, put the nut and bolt through there, and then we can finish mounting it. Now, before we go any further, we're just going to grab the grill and just make sure that where we've got it mounted, it's definitely far enough out of the way and it's not going to be touching anything. If it is, then we're going to have to modify it. Okay, so I can see almost instantly it's going to be very close to the grill. So what we're going to have to do is move it back just a fraction. Okay, so the thing about the Clubman is that it has this little lip all the way along here, and it goes right behind the grill on either side. What we need to be doing is bending this lip all the way down, so that way it gives us a nice flat surface, and that way we can push it back just over this side of the edge. That way this little hole at the front here, which is for the locating tab on the front grill, it can slide straight into there. So we need to bend this down in order to make it fit. So to modify this bracket, I'm just using a pair of pliers, and I'm just going to twist the bodywork down just to give us a little bit of extra room. Yes, I am chipping the paint and it doesn't look or sound good, but it's not going to be seen, so we don't need to worry too much about it.
Alternatively, I could have cut this out using a grinder, but because it was so late at night, I wasn't prepared to wake up the neighbourhood by using a grinder, so a pair of pliers would do the job just fine.
So now that we've bent it down, we're then going to retest it again and see if it'll fit. Now remember, when you're making modifications to your car, you want to test fit things several times before you actually start committing to making the modifications, simply because if you get it wrong to begin with and it's not going the way according to plan, you're going to have to probably drill twice, maybe 3 times before you get it right. So remember, measure twice, cut once. Alright, so we just remove the fresh air intake so we have a little bit more room to access. So now we got it in there, we can see how much room exactly we've got. On the driver's side, we have a little bit more room compared to the passenger side, but there's enough room there that we can mount 2 bolts along the front side of the bracket. And then looking from the front as well, it's slightly hidden, but you can still see it behind the grille. Now I did also forget to mention, underneath here is a heap of wiring, so you want to make sure that when you drill through that you're super careful that you don't punch all the way through and destroy the wiring, causing a short to earth and then causing the car to burn to the ground. Right, now we've drilled the pilot hole, now it's time for the larger hole. Gotta love it when your battery dies halfway through the job. All right, try again. Now here's Tomo's handy tip of the day. When you want to get rid of some metal filings without making a further mess, get yourself a magnet and a rag, put the rag over the magnet, put the magnets then over all of the metal filings. Once you've collected them all, put it over a bin, remove the rag, and it will get rid of the metal filings. If you need to repeat the process, do so as many times as necessary. All right, time to drill the next set of holes. Grab yourself a dustpan, clean up the mess. Now we can start mounting the brackets. Now that we have the brackets mounted, we can mount the oil cooler itself. All right, next step is going to be running both of the oil cooler lines to the block and to the filter housing itself. So before we go any further, the next step we're going to do is remove this oil pipe that goes from the block to the oil filter housing. It is a 3/4 inch spanner we're going to need, and then we're going to remove that. We're going to run the lines there and make sure that they're going to fit. Once we've fitted the pipes, we're then going to remove the cooler and we're going to touch up the paint at the back of the bracket where we had to bend it. So all I'm going to do here is just remove a couple of the ignition leads, trying not to mix them up in which order they came off, and then we can take off the pipe. So we've got the smaller end almost all the way off. We're just going to take out one or two of the spark plugs so we can get access to this top bolt to remove the pipe. So the next part is we're going to discard the old original steel pipe and then put it to the side. Now with both of the lines, they are two different lengths but also two different thread sizes. I originally thought the way that I was going to route it was going to be right, but I was actually incorrect. So what I needed to do was switch over each side with either fittings. So it may look a little wonky in the end, but I ended up getting there. Now the gasket that I'm using is Permatex Aviation gasket. This is the most ideal gasket that you can use for these older engines. It's safe to use on threads as well as things like tapper covers and as well as engine covers. Now like always, you don't need to go ham with this stuff, but you want to just apply enough to make sure that it seals properly, and that way when you start it up, there's not going to be oil flying out everywhere and causing a massive mess. On either end of the pipe, there are two different types of fittings. There is a nut on one end, which is loose, and then there is a crimped steel fitting on the opposite end. Now, the end with the steel crimped fitting, you need to ensure that you attach that first to either the oil filter housing or to the block. If you attach it to the oil cooler first, you'll find that when you go to try and tighten it up, it'll do nothing but kink the pipe. So make sure that you use the right pipe for the right fitting and that you tighten it up first in either the block or the oil filter housing first before tightening it up on the oil cooler. Make sure that you tighten both oil cooler lines at the engine block and the engine oil filter housing first before tightening the nuts at the engine oil cooler. Now with mine, I need to remove the engine oil cooler along with the bracket in order to touch up the paint in which I chipped, modifying the bracket. Right, so down here where the paint's cracked, where we've had to bend it for the brackets, I'm just going to get a bit of touch-up paint and just go over a couple of the areas. If there's any loose paint like there is there, I'll just flake it off. That way we still can protect it and it's not going to do any damage to the vehicle whatsoever. Now one of the best things I ever did was go to Super Cheap Auto and get the paint code for my Mini in a bottle of touch-up paint. That way if you ever get any scratches, nicks, anything like that, you can just go and touch it up. Now it's pretty easy to apply because it's not going to be seen. We don't need to be too cautious with it, and because it's my own car and as I said it's hidden, I'm not overly worried about being perfect. One of the cheapest and most affordable ways to maintain the appearance of a vehicle is with a bottle of touch-up paint. Touch-up paint can be supplied to you by the manufacturer or any good auto parts store or even a paint shop. The way to find out what paint code you have is to look on your VIN plate. It will have a series of letters and or numbers that will tell you exactly what it is made up of. For the investment of $20 or $30, this little tin can be kept in your glove box or in your center console for every time that you get a small scratch or a mark that you can touch up yourself. So we just reassemble it the exact same way that we pulled it apart before. We're going to apply both of the brackets, put the bolts in down below, and then we're going to tighten up the top ones, put the hoses on and reassemble the vehicle. so the last thing we need to do before we start up is run the wiring through for the LED light bar. Alright, now it's connected, we can start it up. Alright, so at the moment it's about 11:30 at night, so I'm not going to start it to check for oil leaks. I'm going to cut it, so next time you see us, we'll be starting it up in the day and we'll be checking for leaks. Alright, so I just got home from work, time to start up, check to see if there's any leaks. Okay, so now that the engine's running, we're just going to have a quick look around to see if there's any oil leaks. We want to be checking the fitting down here on the block. Doesn't appear to be anything leaking, as well as the fitting down here on the oil filter housing itself. There's nothing there, and both of the fittings at the top of the oil cooler. So there we have it, that's how you install an oil cooler on a classic Mini. Don't forget that when you're installing this, you may need to mock it up several times before you actually commit to drilling and mounting the oil cooler. Don't forget also to put a bit of sealant on the pipes, that way it's not going to leak. Thanks heaps for watching, stay COVID safe guys, and we'll see you next time on an episode of Tomo's Tune-Ups, all things DIY and mechanical.